Good evening, church. Hope you had a good week. We had a pretty interesting week as well. Just waiting and waiting and waiting and getting things sorted here. We're thinking about you guys. We are praying for you, and I hope that you guys are doing spiritually well. I hope that worship was great this morning. Hope you're excited about the warmer weather. And tonight we have some time to look at some text again. We're in the book of Daniel, and we are in chapter 3. We're going to talk about a few things over there in a while. In chapter 1, we saw Daniel and his three friends. They get taken captive by the great Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar. And they're taken into his palace, and there they are indoctrinated. They are taught the language and the history, and they are influenced by the culture of the Babylonians, and they each received a different name, which means that these Babylonians wanted to take away their old life, their identity. And we also spoke about the idea that they were possibly castrated, because a guy like Daniel, for example, we don't see any evidence that he ever got married, and the person that was in charge over him was also in charge of the eunuchs, and so that's very likely. And that's a sad story. It's actually sad to realize that people used to do this. They used to strip you of your identity, and even strip you possibly of your sexuality. They refused to eat the king's food when the king said, hey, eat this meat and whatever the case were, and they managed to find a way to eat just a plant-based diet, and after 10 days they looked better than any of the other young men that were also potentially going to be in the king's service. And God also gave them tremendous wisdom and understanding, and that made them find favor in the eyes of the king. So that was chapter 1. And chapter 2 was about dreams, and that's what we spoke about last week. Nebuchadnezzar has a dream about this massive statue, and he wants his dream interpreted, but he doesn't just want anybody to interpret it. He wants somebody to interpret it who knows what his dream is, because that would then clearly be evidence that that person has got contact with the divine. And so none of the astrologers and magicians can give the king an explanation of the dream, or even tell the king what he dreamt. And so he decides to kill all of them, and that's where Daniel puts up his hands. He says, no, let's do something different. And so he goes home, he asks for some time from Nebuchadnezzar, goes home, tells his three friends, and asks them to pray. And they pray for him, and that night they go to sleep. Well, they prayed for themselves as well, because they would also be killed. And that night he received the dream that the king had. And that dream is significant, this great statue that represents basically the future of the world at that stage, of the kingdoms of the world. And for us now today, it's the history of the world. That the Babylonians were ruling, and then came the Persians, and then came the Greeks, and then came the Romans, and then finally came a kingdom that was started by a rock that was flung and shattered these kingdoms to pieces. And that rock we believe is Christ, and that kingdom we believe is the kingdom of God that Matthew speaks about. And that rock grew into, and it filled the whole earth. And that's a wonderful picture that King Nebuchadnezzar saw of the coming kingdoms. So yeah, it's an interesting book so far. At the end of chapter 2, we see the king places Daniel as the third highest in the kingdom, with his three friends also receiving high positions. Daniel received this blessing from the king because he was capable of interpreting the dream for him. God was with him. Now, although difficult, it seems like some years have passed. It's difficult for us to determine, but it seems like some years have passed since the end of chapter 2 and the beginning of the story that we read in chapter 3. Some scholars say it's about 18 years. Some say between 14 and 16 years, and still somebody else said 40 years. Let's just say it was a fairly long amount of time, and you'll pick that up as we read the text then tonight. If you've got your Bible with you, please turn there with me. That is Daniel chapter 3. We're going to read the whole chapter. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold, 27 meters high and almost 3 meters wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he had set up. And so the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "This is what you are commanded to do, O peoples, nations, and men of every language. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the peoples, nations, and men of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You have issued a decree, O king, that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They pay no attention to you, O king. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of the fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, O king." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair of their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defied the king's command, and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Therefore I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces, and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. The famous story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Story that we learned from Sunday school, right? What is so interesting for me is that all three of these chapters in Daniel that we've looked at so far start with Nebuchadnezzar. It's as if so far this whole book is about him. First, it is him conquering Jerusalem and taking God's people captive. And then in chapter 2, it's him having some type of a dream. And now in the third chapter, he's the one that's the main character. He erects a huge statue of gold. Now, it cannot be a full statue of gold. They say that would have cost too much. I mean, they say it's just impossible. The scholars, it's just too much gold. And also, the statue is probably not of a fully fledged man, because it would be a little bit disproportionate. It's about 8 stories high and about 3 meters wide. So if you look in proportion, it probably was sort of a pedestal with a man on top of that, or a god, or whatever the image was. Otherwise, it would be quite a rickety of a man, very thin and tall. And it wasn't made of solid gold, because it would just take too much gold. So it was probably just gold plated. This focus on Nebuchadnezzar for me is interesting. It is as if Daniel wanted the focus on this man. He wanted the focus on Nebuchadnezzar, this man who conquered God's people. And he wanted to show how God uses this man, and how God humiliates him, and how God works with him. And so the whole story seems to revolve around the greatest king of the greatest kingdom on earth, and how God from heaven manipulates him, humiliates him, and works with him. And even in the text for tonight, we see how this king fluctuates with his emotions. I don't know if you picked that up, but one moment he's angry, the next moment he's more angry, he's more furious, and then the next moment he's in a state of total humility, and he worships the God of heaven and earth. Now, I've entitled the lesson for tonight, Dedication to Decree, because that's what we see happen in this chapter. First, you've got this dedication, this consecration. The text says that the king wanted to dedicate this statue, and he wanted all of the people of Babylon, all the important people, to come to the dedication, where they're going to dedicate this statue to a holy position in Babylonian society. You see, dedicate means to consecrate for a religious purpose. That's what we see in the beginning of the chapter. And what we see in the end of the chapter is a decree. A decree where King Nebuchadnezzar now says, hey, if anybody ever, I decree this, anybody ever speak badly about the God of the Jews, he will be destroyed. This is a decree that I put in writing. So it starts off with him dedicating this whole worship service to a false god, and it ends with him sending out a decree into the whole of Babylonia about the true God of heaven, that nobody is allowed to touch the people of that God. And that for me is very interesting. It starts with a pagan God and it ends with the God of the Jews, Yahweh. Now, anyways, allow me to point out some questions that came to my mind the first time that I read the text, and maybe there were some questions on your side as well. The first question for me was this: why did Nebuchadnezzar build this statue? The text doesn't say. And why was he so adamant that everyone in his kingdom should bow down to it and worship? Why not just make it, and if it's his desire, and then say, okay, now you guys can go worship it if you want to? No, he wants everybody to worship that image. Now, there's been some debate about what the statue was of. Some have said it was a statue of Nebuchadnezzar's father. Let me just see if I can get this right. His name was Nabopolassar. But most scholars agree that rather it was an image of the Babylonian god Bel. Now, we've spoken about Bel, right? And Bel was sort of a follow-up god of Marduk, the typical Babylonian god. It's sort of like they're the same thing. So I just want to share with you what Britannica says about this god. And it starts with Marduk. Marduk's star was Jupiter, and his sacred animals were horses, dogs, and especially the so-called dragon with forked tongue, representations of which adorn his city walls. On the oldest monuments, Marduk is represented holding a triangular spade or a hoe, interpreted as an emblem of fertility and vegetation. He is also pictured walking or in his war chariot, typically his tunic is adorned with stars. In his hand is a scepter, and he carries a bow, a spear, net, and a thunderbolt. Kings of Assyria and Persia also honored Marduk and Zarpanitu in inscriptions and rebuilt many of their temples. Marduk was later known as Bel, a name derived from the Semitic word Baal or Lord. Bel had all the attributes of Marduk, and his statues and cult and his status and cult were much the same. But Bel, however, gradually came to be thought of as the god of order and destiny. So this god developed a higher level of superiority among the gods. Now there's a few words that stand out for me based on what we know about this god Bel, and I'm going to read it to you, and it's on your screen as well. Fertility, vegetation, war, chariot, bow, spear, net, thunderbolt, order, and destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, ancient people worshiped their gods to get something from them. Now, when you read these words, why do you think Nebuchadnezzar wanted everyone to worship this god? You see, because Bel is the god that will help you with fertility, and it will get the vegetation to grow. It is also a god that sits in a war chariot, and the Babylonians had to make war. There's a bow and a spear. That's got to do with warfare, and there's a net to catch people. There's a thunderbolt. There is order, and there is destiny. These are all things that any king, any pagan ancient king would be interested in to have multiplication of in his kingdom. He wanted showered on his kingdom what Bel could provide. That is what he wanted. But in order to get that, in order to get the blessings of Bel, to receive the full blessings of the gods, he had to get the full devotion of his people, all the Babylonians, all the people under his power. All of Babylon had to worship Bel in order for all of Babylon to be blessed by Bel. So when 3 people rebel against this worship ceremony, the people believed the whole nation was put at risk. You silly 3 people, just worship him so we all can be blessed. That is why Nebuchadnezzar warns the people that you will be thrown into the furnace for rebellion, because they would be robbing all of Babylon of the blessings of Bel. And we know this is a fact in the Old Testament with the Jews as well. Do you remember that? I mean, look at Jeremiah chapter 5, where God says to Jeremiah, look, go throughout Jerusalem, you find one righteous man, I'll not destroy this place. So we see, well, that's probably not a good example, but we see in other places in the Old Testament how all of the Israelites had to be obedient. All of the Israelites had to obey God, and those who didn't, they were to be cast out. And I'm sure there's a number of examples popping up in your mind. We also have to note here something interesting. The Babylonians, like most ancient nations, they were polytheistic. And that means that they worshipped many gods. Now the Jews, they were monotheistic. They only worship one God. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. That's the Shema. The general Babylonian public couldn't understand the big deal with the Jews. Why not just bow down to this God? You can still worship your God, Yahweh. We're not telling you to leave your God. Just give honor to Baal so we can all be blessed. Be inclusive. Don't be judgmental. Your God is not the only God. Your God is not better than ours. And so get back to the questions. Nebuchadnezzar wanted the blessing, the protection, the providence of Baal over his reign as king and also his kingdom. And he knew he had to get everyone in his kingdom to honor Baal in order to access that blessing. But he made a silly mistake. In chapter 1, we see that it was the invisible God who gave him his kingdom. In chapter 2, we saw it was the invisible God who appeared to him in a dream. No other God has ever done that to him. And by chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar should be a different person, worshipping only one God. I mean, if you go look at chapter 2, he confessed with his own mouth. He said, surely your God, the God of Daniel, is the God of gods and the Lord of kings. Now, if he lived up to that, he would have to build a statue to some other non-existent God. Instead of honoring the God who has spoken to him in his dreams, he builds his own God out of gold and thinks that it will bless him. So he made a bit of a mistake there. And then there's a third question that pops up into my mind is, why did Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to worship the statue? Sorry, that's the second question. Why did they refuse to worship the statue? And I'm sure this is perhaps one of the easiest questions to deal with. Consider Exodus 20 verse 3 to 6. This is part of the 10 commandments, and there's 2 commandments in here. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. Leviticus 19 and verse 4 says, do not turn to idols or make gods of cast metal for yourselves. I am the Lord your God. I look at this text and it's quite a black and white thing, right? But it still makes me wonder. Bowing down to a statue doesn't mean you really believe it is a god, right? Isn't it just maybe reasonable to say, well, you can go bow down. Nothing's going to happen. You're not really worshiping a real God. Go bow down. Your life will be saved. Your heart belongs to Jehovah. So all is good. As long as your heart belongs to God, it doesn't matter if you go bow down in front of that God. You know it's not a real God. You are allowed to worship Yahweh. You can go worship him at any time. Why take this command so serious? After all, these guys didn't make an idol for themselves here, right? The text says that you are not allowed to make an idol for yourself. And so you could argue and say, well, they didn't make the idol. King Nebuchadnezzar did. What is the big deal? Right? For the sake of peace, man. The guy's going to throw you in the fire. Why don't you just go bow down? Just submit to it quickly. I'd like to suggest 2 reasons why that was not an option for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. First of all, bowing down to a pagan god is a denial of Yahweh. You might believe whatever you want to in your heart. That's fine. But when the Babylonians around you see you bow down to that image, they think that you believe that Yahweh is just another god amongst the gods. They would deny the Shema in front of pagans if they bowed down. Secondly, bowing down with pagans demonstrates unification with them. In other words, if they did bow down, they would symbolize the unity with these pagans. They would state through that action of bowing down, they would say, we are one. We are together. We worship the same God. Whether we worship different gods doesn't matter. We are one human race, one people, different languages, but we have the same God. We are one. Only one thing was one to these guys, and that oneness is the Yahweh of the Shema. And so I think it's understandable why these guys refuse to bow down. Thirdly, third question, simple question. Why did the astrologers tattletale? If you look at their history, it becomes quite evident. These Jews were in a cycle. Rebel, reveal, excel. Rebel, reveal, excel. That in a nutshell is how God worked with them. Look at, for example, in chapter 1. They rebelled against eating the food from the king. And through their new diet, God is revealed to the king. And they are chosen to be the best by the king. They were chosen to be his top servants. In chapter 2, they rebel against the execution. And through the dream, they reveal God is with them. And they are given the highest places in the kingdom. Now, how does this feel for other magicians and astrologers? Right? How does it feel for them? These guys from another country, they keep on being elevated above us. They keep on ruling over us. They feel humiliated. They couldn't interpret the dream. They were supposed to, but they couldn't. And these foreign captives receive a higher place in the Babylonian Empire than they did. And they were pure Babylonians. So when they hear these guys refuse to bow down to the image, they felt this was the opportunity to get them eliminated. But what happened? The same sequence happened again. Rebel, reveal, excel. And so every time it's a problem for these guys. The whole host of special people were called, and it's actually almost comical, to come bow down to the statue, and they all did. And so all of these interesting, important people came down to the statue and they bowed down to it. And then the whole host comes to the furnace after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego has been taken out, and to inspect them, and they can't even smell that they've been in fire. And so all of these guys were humiliated by these three men. You see the same thing again. So these astrologers probably felt humiliated and wanted some vengeance. But there was something more going on in the story. These astrologers, they were acting in flesh and they were acting in their worldliness. Little did they know that they were just instruments in the hand of a being that we call Satan. He was the instigator of pagan gods. He was the instigator of the erection of this statue. He's the instigator of images made to look like things. And he was the instigator in the heart of Nebuchadnezzar to find a way to put the faithless Jews in one of two positions. Worship whom I say, or you die. Now with that in mind, let me switch over to our lives. I'd like to spend the rest of this lesson looking at some common themes that I see. Let me try and build a bridge from the world of Nebuchadnezzar to ours and just provide the following pointers. First of all, expect drifting. When Nebuchadnezzar encountered his dream and Daniel interpreted the dream, he went on as if his life has changed. With his mouth, he confessed the sovereignty of the God of Daniel. Forward 18 years later, and he puts up a massive statue, forces everyone in all of Babylon to bow down to it. And if you don't bow down, you will be killed in a furnace. Do you see the drifting? He confesses with his mouth the God of heaven and earth. And 18 years later, he's back to worshipping statues. Do you see the drifting? In my experience, ladies and gentlemen, we all drift. We're in an ocean. Look at the book of Judges. We see clearly they drift, they come closer to God again, they drift. It's like we row closer to God and then we drift again. The beauty here is that at the end of chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar once again gives Yahweh the honor due him. The point is this: where do we stand with God at the end? And because we never know where the end is, drifting is a very dangerous thing to do. We can expect other people to drift. People will drift, but often they will row back again. Nobody is lost forever until they are dead. Don't write people off. They might come back. And nobody is saved forever until they are dead. Don't assume you are safe until the day that you close your eyes. Secondly, what I also would like to share with you is the following: that we need to expect pressure from the majority to conform to inclusivity. Expect pressure from the majority to conform to inclusivity. For the average Babylonian, every god was legit and every god was as good as the other. It was a normal way of life. Everybody worshipped who they wanted to, and they worshipped all the gods. They were all valid and they were all correct. I'm sure that even the God of the Jews were considered to be legit by many of the Babylonians. The problem came when the Jews refused to buy into it. When Jews started saying, there's only one God, dude. There's only one God. Your gods are no gods at all. That is when pagan Babylon society had a problem with them. You see, the pagans were religiously inclusive. I find it so interesting because that is exactly the same pattern that is going on in the West. All religions are equally valid and should be treated as equal. We're all the same, going to the same place, come from the same place. Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, it's all the same. Everything is equal. It's interesting that the same spirit is busy infiltrating much of our world. One of the most difficult things to say in the public domain today, and I'm sure that it's in America the same as well, is that Jesus is the only way. That will get you a load of persecution. Because when you say that, you exclude all other faiths. When you say that, people see you as unloving, uncaring, and uninclusive, if there's a word like that. And so you will look like the bad guy, but you have no choice. because Jesus said there's only one way. And so we must expect the pressure. The pressure will come to force us to adopt the idea that all religions are just equal. Thirdly, expect some buckle under the pressure. Expect some to buckle under the pressure. The text says in verse 12, some Jews did not bow down to this idol. Well, if some did, then it means some didn't. So it seems like there were some Jews who did bow down to the idol, and there were some Jews who said, no, I won't. Jordan Peterson appropriates idolatry, and he gives it a modern term, which is ideology. And in his mind, he says ideology and idolatry is basically the same thing. It's just in different times. In other words, modern idolatry is ideology. And I agree with him. Let me explain. There are certain ideologies permeating our society that sounds true, but they're not true according to Scripture. For example, all women are oppressed, should be liberated and given equal outcomes. And in a certain sense, that is true. In the sense that a woman is not equal to a man, that is absolutely not true. Men and women are absolutely equal, but they're not equal in different roles. For example, Peter speaks about it. If myself and Alfreda would go into a boxing match, I would probably knock her out because I'm physically stronger. So we are not equal, okay, in the category of strengths. She might be more intelligent or more emotionally stable, but in terms of strength, she fails. There are some more ideologies. A mother decides whether a living being in a womb can be killed or not. That's the abortion story. Another one that's rampant. Gender is a spectrum, and gender is constructed by society. It's not biological. Evolution is the sole explanation of life on earth. These are all ideologies. These are idols that are raised in society. And when you and I refuse to bow down to these ideologies, it's the same thing as bowing down to an idol in the 5th century before Christ. These ideologies are impressed on our children. It's taught to our kids in school. They are worshipped on TV. And some of our own Christians have now bowed down to these ideologies. And that's the point I'm trying to make here. Some will bow down to the ideologies. You have transgender preachers now. You've got female preachers. You've got female elders. Despite what the text says, you've got churches that actively promote homosexuality and say, well, this is a gay church. Idol worship is everywhere, ladies and gentlemen. We just call it something different. A fourth point is this. Expect anger and aggression when you defy these modern ideologies. Look at what happened when Nebuchadnezzar heard about these 3 guys refusing to bow down. Verse 13 says, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned them. After he spoke to them and they still rejected his command, the text says in verse 19 that he was furious with them and that he heated the furnace 7 times hotter than normal. He had them tied by the strongest men in his army. Goodness, those are actions of serious anger. Ladies and gentlemen, when you are in conversation with someone who worships modern ideologies or modern idols, and you say things like homosexuality is sin, that sex and gender is biological, there's male and female, that abortion is murder, that a boy is a boy and a girl is a girl, you will see how the rage will intensify. Nobody from the other side is friendly with you if you say things like that. Exactly the same thing as the days of Daniel. Why? Because there is a spirit at work in the disobedient. That you read in Ephesians 2 verse 2. 3 points left. Prepare to disobey government if obedience to God is at play. The question often comes across my table, how can I honor and respect and obey the government if the government is so corrupt and expects of me to believe in the things that they do that disagrees with what the Bible says? Why does God put corrupt leaders in government? And these are loaded questions, right? But the important thing we see these 3 guys do is this. Their obedience to God trumps their obedience to the king. Obey the king, obey the government, as long as it or he doesn't force you to be disobedient to God. So God is always obeyed first. And second to last, prepare to obey God even if God does not bless or protect you. And if there's any point, I know it's a bit longer tonight than other nights, if there's any point I'd like you to hold on to it, specifically this point. Prepare to obey God even if God does not bless or protect you. The most beautiful text in this whole chapter is this: O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. I find this incredible. They had made up their minds that they would not disobey God. It was non-debatable. They were not sure if God would save them. And what is interesting for me here is that most of us are not like this. Most of us would pray, Lord, if you save me from this furnace and deliver me from the king, I will serve you in the temple for the rest of my life. Look at Jacob. Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. That's Genesis 28:20-21. Isn't that interesting? Jacob says, if you do this or do that, then you will be my God. But these three fellas have a totally different take. It doesn't matter what you do, you are my God. And it doesn't matter what you don't do, you remain my God. Let me ask the question, where do you stand on this? Is God your God on the good days and the bad days? Can you say to God, come what may? And my last point, prepare for a miracle, not disobedience. If you look at the text, we see Nebuchadnezzar phrase these words in such a way that these three men had no other way out. You bow down to this image and worship it, or you will die. You will burn in the furnace. I will get the strongest soldiers to tie you up, and you will be reduced to ashes. You only have two options: worship my image or burn. Have you ever been there? Deny God or suffer? Logically and naturally, it's correct that these guys only had two options. There wasn't no option. Unless there is a God who does miracles and who intervenes in the plans of men, ladies and gentlemen. Often we find ourselves in the same boat. And we do the ungodly thing. We choose to bow down instead of take the suffering. Because we thought it was the only option. We then say, well, I had no choice. Yes, you had. Rather die than disobey. Rather choose disobedience over death. That's what people say. No, rather choose death over disobedience. May God bless you. Have a wonderful week. Start reading Daniel chapter 4 so long for next week. Love you all. Bye.